Wes from Carl Wesley Sewing Patterns here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a sweater vest using sweater knit fabric. The pattern is sized for men, sizes extra small to 2XL. If you haven't already done so, you can purchase this pattern as a PDF download from my online shop, and a link will be posted in the description below. Once you have your paper sewing pattern cut out and assembled, it's going to look something like this. I need a size small, so that's what I have cut out here. A few things I want to point out about the sewing pattern. 3 of these pieces are cut on the fold of the fabric, which are the hemband, the front, and the back, which are noted by these markings here. And the long arrowed lines on the pattern indicate the greatest stretch of the fabric. The triangle markings on the edges of the pattern pieces indicate notches, and those should be snipped through all layers of the fabric, or you can mark them with chalk or tracing paper if you prefer. Colored notches are specific to your size, and black notches are notches that are the same for all sizes. Sweater knit or hachi knit fabric will work best for this sewing pattern, and preferably it has a spandex fiber content. 1 yard to 1.5 yards of fabric should be plenty to sew this pattern. However, you may need more depending on the width of the fabric or to match stripes or patterns. All the fabrics that I used to sew samples for this pattern were purchased from Fabric Mart Fabrics, and while this particular fabric is probably not available by the time you see this video, Fabric Mart does have a variety of sweater knits that rotate in and out of stock. Now let's talk about cutting. Since I have 3 pattern pieces that are cut on the fold of the fabric, I laid out my fabric with 2 folds and the selvage edges matching in the center. If you are using striped fabric like I am, you want to lay out the fabric carefully so that the colored stripes match through all layers of fabric. We also want to be mindful of where we're placing our pattern pieces on the stripes and how it's going to come together in our finished sweater vest. Most importantly, we want our side seams to match, and the easiest way to achieve this is to lay out the front and back pattern pieces of the sweater vest so that the bottom edge matches on the same stripe. The placement of the other pattern pieces is really up to you. You just want to think about how this is going to look on your finished garment. I highly suggest cutting out your pattern pieces using weights and a rotary cutter instead of scissors, because we don't want our fabric to shift around while we're cutting. If you choose to mark your notches with clips using scissors, make sure you only make tiny snips in the fabric because we want these to disappear in the seam allowance during sewing. All the seam allowances for the sewing pattern are 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, which is your standard seam allowance for serging. The remaining pattern pieces are not cut on the fold of the fabric, so I'm going to open up the fabric and reposition it to cut these pieces. We need to cut 1 neckband and 2 armhole opening bindings. We want our armhole bindings to match, so if you're using stripes, make sure to position those pattern pieces on the exact same stripes. After you finish cutting and open up your pattern pieces that are on the fold, here's what you will have. 1 neckband, 2 armhole opening bindings, 1 front piece, 1 back piece, and 1 hemband. Now let's get to the sewing. The first thing we need to do is stitch the shoulder seams. To do this, we place the front and back pieces right sides facing and serge together the shoulder seams at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. It is often difficult to tell the right from wrong sides on sweater knit fabrics, and if this is the case for you, it may be helpful to go through and mark all your pieces with colored chalk on the wrong sides before you start sewing. When stitching the shoulder seams on your sweater vest, just allow your serger to pull the fabric through. Do not stretch as you are sewing. We don't want our shoulder seams to get stretched out. Next, we want to stabilize our shoulder seams. To do this, I'm going to stitch clear elastic over the serging of my shoulder seams using a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. This is typically the way that shoulder seams are stabilized in ready-to-wear sweaters. The clear elastic I used is 1/4 of an inch wide and was purchased from Amazon. It is possible to attach the elastic in the same step as serging the shoulder seams. However, I don't suggest this because it is a bit more difficult. If you don't have any clear elastic available, you could also do something like fuse a narrow strip of interfacing to the shoulder seams or attach a woven fabric binding strip. The main goal is that we don't want the shoulder seams to stretch out during wearing or washing of the garment. In this step, I am applying a very gentle stretch to the elastic, but I am not stretching the fabric of the shoulder seam. Next, we need to stitch our neckband into a loop. Fold the neckband in half, right sides facing, with the edges of the cutout V matching. Now, using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, we're going to use a straight stitch to stitch the V. Stitch until you get to the point of the V, sink the needle, and pivot to stitch the other side. You will notice that as I get close to the point of the V, I sink the needle and pivot my fabric so that I can make sure that the seam allowance on the second half of the V is a perfect 3/8 seam. If you take just one stitch at a time, you will eventually get the perfect seam allowance on the second side of the V. If you find it easier, you can also mark the entire stitching line with chalk, and then you will know exactly where the pivot point of the stitching is. Using your scissors, place a clip at the point of the V directly up to the stitching, but not through the stitching. Now, press open the seam that we just made. Be mindful of the fiber content of your sweater knit and make sure you use an appropriate temperature on your iron. I use an iron shoe on the plate of my iron, and that prevents scorching or damaging the fabric on synthetic or delicate materials. Now fold in half your neckband, matching the seams that we just made and matching the raw edges. We will be folding the neckband wrong sides together all the way around the loop of the neckband, which also encloses the seam that we just made. Here's what the completed neckband will look like. At this point, I also like to press the neckband so that the fold edge is nice and crisp. These little triangles of fabric that are sticking out from the neckband point can be cut off. This is what the completed neckband will look like. Now, we need to get ready to sew the neckband to the sweater vest, but first, we need to make some markings in chalk to aid us in the sewing. Turn your sweater vest right side out and mark a line in chalk for the center front of your sweater vest at the neckline. After that, match the center front of the neckline to the center back neckline. We already know where the center back is because there is a notch on your pattern. We need to find quarter points 3 and 4 around the opening of our neckline. With the center front and center back matching, walk the edges together to find these points on the left and right sides of your neckline and mark them with chalk. Please note that these third and fourth quarter points will not be the shoulder seams of the sweater vest. They will actually fall on the front of the sweater vest a little bit beneath the shoulder seams. We also need to mark our neckband quarterwise with chalk. We already know where the center front and center back of the neckband are because the center front is where the seam is and the center back is where the notch on your pattern is. Similar to how we marked the neckline on our sweater vest, lay your neckband flat with the center front and center back matching, and the folds on the left and right hand sides will be the third and fourth quarter points of the neckband. All these chalk marks are going to be very helpful for matching things up when we sew our neckband to the sweater vest. Here are some close-up pictures showing you the markings we just made on the neckband and the sweater vest neckline. There's one final chalk marking we need to make before we can sew. Using a ruler, mark the 3/8 inch seam allowance in chalk along the point of the neckband. The chalk marks will cross to make an X. Sewing the neckband is by far the hardest part of this whole sewing project, but once you get this down, the rest is easy. Place the neckband on top of your sweater vest with the point of the neckband matching the point of the neckline like I'm showing you here. You will want to have the seam in the neckband lined up with the center front chalk mark on your sweater vest. Using a pointed object, such as an awl, place the point on the chalk mark X and secure this point down so that you can pivot the neckband around to match the neckline of the sweater vest. This pivot point is where we're going to sink the needle to start stitching. Being as careful as possible to keep everything in place, It's best to secure this with a pin before we take it to our sewing machine. Now we're going to baste in the neckband with the longest stitch length straight stitch on our sewing machine. Lower your needle directly into the fabric where the chalk X mark is, and then remove the pin. Now we can start stitching around our neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The neckband is intentionally cut just a little bit smaller than the neckline of the sweater vest, so you will need to stretch it gently while sewing. Stretch the neckband just enough to match up the quarter points, which are indicated by our chalk marks and notches. I recommend using contrasting thread for this step so that it will be easier to see when we remove these stitches later. Once you get about 3/4 of the way around the neckline, you will realize that you need to put the entire sweater vest through the loop of the neckband. This sounds confusing, but it will make a lot more sense once you get there. Stop stitching directly at the point where you started stitching. This picture shows what the basted in neckband will look like. I am rarely a fan of using basting in sewing projects. However, for this particular neckband, I do feel that this step is particularly important to make sure that everything is sewn perfectly before we go to the serger. At this point, check to see how your neckband looks from the outside of your garment. If everything looks good, we are ready to go to the serger. If you need to make some adjustments, it's very easy to unpick the basting stitches at this point and readjust. Now that we have basting stitches keeping everything secure, it's very easy to serge the neckband to the neck opening. I like to stitch onto the fabric at the point of the V, stitch all the way around the back of the neckline, and then off once I get back to the point. Now that the neckband is attached with serging, we can go back and pull out all the basting stitches. I'm going to place a dot of fray check at the start and stop of the serging to secure the stitching. This next step is optional, but next I'm going to top stitch down the seam allowance we just made so that it lays flat away from the neckband. I prefer to use matching thread on this step that blends into the material, but you can use a contrasting color depending on the look that you're going for. Any kind of stretch stitch will work great here, such as a twin needle stitch or a cover stitch if you have that machine available, but I'm going to use a 3-step zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. Start your stitching at the center back of the sweater vest and stitch all the way around the neckband, pivoting at the point of the V. The white thread I used really blended into this material, so you can't even see the top stitching, but this will hold that seam allowance down and keep it from flapping around. Now that we have the neckband finished, the rest of the sewing is really very easy. The next thing we need to do is turn our sweater vest back inside out and stitch the side seams right side spacing. This step is where we need to take care to match the stripes or pattern of our fabric. Use a 3/8 inch seam allowance on your serger and do not stretch the fabric during sewing. To make sure the stripes of my side seam are nice and matched up all the way through, I match up just a few inches at a time and work through the seam section by section. Now we need to stitch the hemband and the armhole opening bindings. Fold all three of these pieces in half, right sides facing, so that the short edges match. Now we're going to take all three of these to the serger and stitch the short edges together. Now that we have the hemband and armhole bindings stitched into loops, we will fold them in half along the length so that the raw edges meet and the serged seams are enclosed. When folding these loops in half, you will be placing the wrong sides facing. Similar to how we marked the neckband, we need to mark the armhole opening bindings quarter-wise with chalk. By laying these pieces flat, you can match the seam to the notch on the opposite side, and this will allow you to find quarter points 3 and 4. Mark both armhole opening bindings the same way, quarter-wise, with chalk. We won't need to mark the hemband because this is already marked quarter-wise with 3 notches and 1 seam. We also need to mark quarter points on all 3 unfinished openings of the sweater vest. The hemband and the armhole bindings are all cut a little bit smaller than the openings, so we need these quarter points marked to help us distribute the stretch during sewing. Working with the sweater vest turned right side out, you can find quarter points 3 and 4 on the armholes by matching the shoulder seam to the underarm seam. Mark the second armhole same as the first. Now that we have all the quarter points marked on the arm opening bindings and on the armholes of the sweater vest, we can match them with pins or sewing clips. The seam in the armhole binding will be matched with the underarm seam. We will be matching the raw edges of the binding loop to the raw edge of the arm opening of the sweater vest, and these will all get serged together in the next step. Now, let's do the same thing with the hemband. The quarter points we need on the bottom of the sweater vest are the 2 side seams and the center front and center back. You can easily find the center front and center back by folding the sweater vest in half. You can mark the center front or the center back either with a small snip or with chalk. In this case, I just grabbed my scissors and made a tiny snip. Same as we did with the armhole bindings, let's clip a hemband to the bottom of the sweater vest. In the round, use clips or pins to match all the quarter points and all 3 raw edges. The seam in the hemband can be matched to either of the side seams. Personally, I don't think it matters if you match it to the left or right one. Now, we are ready to head to the serger and stitch on all 3 of these bindings in the round. The bindings will all be stitched to the sweater vest the same way. You will be serging 3 raw edges together in the round. Stitch these with the binding loop on top because you will need to gently stretch the binding during sewing. Stretch the binding loop just gently enough to match the quarter points to the opening, but do not stretch the fabric of the sweater vest on the underside. Here are two pictures showing the armhole binding and hemband after stitching. Now, all that's left to do is turn out the armhole bindings and the hemband. Congrats! Now your sweater vest is complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial from Carl Wesley Sewing Patterns. If you have any additional questions or need something cleared up about this sewing tutorial, please drop a comment below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Stay tuned for new pattern releases and more sewing videos coming soon. Thanks for watching.